Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to another part of Data Eco-Culture. Our panel today is Data Sharing with Whom and Why. My name is Francesca Accinelli, and I'm the Vice President of Promotion, Communication, and International Relations from Telefilm Canada. It's my pleasure to be your host today. I'm a bit of a data geek, so I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with all of you. Before we begin, it's very important for us to talk about and acknowledge the importance of the lands on which we're situated. From coast to coast to coast in Canada, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation people that call this land home. For example, in Toronto, it is the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. But it is also a city that is a major gathering place for many Indigenous people from all over Canada, including Métis. The 10 First Nations of Montreal, Quebec include Cree, Mi'kmaq, Nekabi, Algonquin, Montagnais, Abenaki, Mohawk, Atikamekw, Huron, and Malasite. And Montreal is home to a large Inuit community. We acknowledge these people and the lands to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and their cultures. Please join me to acknowledge the values, perspectives, languages, cultures, which can guide us, inspire us, and the role of the Indigenous people as guardians and stewards of the land, and to consider how we can each, in our own way, form reconciliation and collaboration. So thank you, one and all. So as I said, our panel is on data sharing, with whom and why. We're not going to get too technical. We're going to stay high level to really just explore the purpose of data sharing. We ask you to join the conversation using the social media hashtag #DataEcoCulture. We also have a live transcriber or translation. The majority, I would say, of this panel we've chosen to do in English. Alors, si vous voulez partager en français, s'il vous plaît, cliquez sur français et
if you want to hear the interpretation, you click on the simultaneous interpretation at the top of your screen into French.
Today is going to be an introduction of our three panelists. Then we have three, I'll call them big questions that we're going to talk about, and we're really going to work hard to have some questions at the end. When we get to the question and answer period, you'll be able to enter your questions at the bottom of the screen. I'm now going to start with our first panelist. I'd like to introduce Joan Jenkinson. She's the Executive Director of the Black Screen Office. Joan?
Hi, thank you for having me. I didn't realize how exciting data was, but the more I talk about it, the more the geeks come out of the woodwork, so it's great. Just to say, the Black Screen Office has been around for just a little over 4 months, and we're a national not-for-profit organization that supports Black communities throughout the screen industries.
Perfect. Thank you, Joan. I'm next going to turn to Robin Sokoloski, Director of Organizational Development, Mass Culture.
Thanks, Francesca. As Francesca said, my name is Robin. I am the Director of Organizational Development at Mass Culture, which is an art support organization. We are very community-based focused to make sure that research is prioritized first by the sector itself. And we are working towards building a national network to support greater capacity for research, data, and knowledge in the sector.
Perfect. And now on to Patrick Lozeau, conseiller en innovation, données, Ville de Montréal.
Innovation Counselor, Ville Montréal.
Thanks for having me today. So I work for the Urban Innovation Lab in Montreal. So I've been working with open data for the last 5 and more years. But I'm also here to talk about Montreal in Commons, which is our smart city challenge here in Montreal, where we're working on mutualization of data on social aspects and mobility aspects. So glad to here to talk with all of you.
Perfect. Okay, so let's get started. So the first question I'm going to pose to all of you, and we'll start with Joan. What is the value of data sharing, and why do you engage in it?
for the Black community, there's very little data. So when the lid was blown off on systemic racism in the Canadian screen industries, there was a rush to do diversity, in equity and inclusion programs, but no one knew where to start. And we in the Black community had firsthand experience of anti-Black racism, and we didn't need research to tell us that where we stood in the industry. There are virtually no Black gatekeepers or decision makers. We know that in the history of Canadian television, there have only been 4 TV series and 1 comedy series made by about Black Canadians, and that on average it takes 10 years for Black filmmakers to get their second film made. So we could count on, 2 hands, the statistics that we have. But of course we value them, and moving forward, we want to be sure to gather as much information as we can, because as an organization, we need to know who we serve. And as an industry, we need a starting point for policies and practices that are being instituted. Our plan is to ensure that our research generates sector interest, that it informs programs, and that it encourages new collaborations. And our end result is that there will be greater employment of Black Canadians working throughout the screen industries.
Great. Robin?
Well, I've been working in the sector, the art sector in Canada for over 20 years now, and just found as an arts practitioner, myself and my colleagues, there was a real need for, and a growing need for, evidence-based information. We need to better understand ourselves and what we have, how we can possibly collaborate with one another, and then potentially even how we might use that information, knowledge, and data to form a collective voice for a number of different reasons, from everything from advocacy to maybe even accessing social finance. So these are some things that I feel are really essential, and knowledge, research, data are all those components, those pieces of infrastructure that I think will help strengthen the art sector.
Wonderful. And Patrick?
Yeah, so coming from open data has been a large movement that's been going on for more than 15 years in different parts of the world. And in Montreal, the open data movement started back in around 2010, 2011. And the point was that the data that the city collects is collected to operate services and to know how the city is going, stuff like that. And in the end, that data is paid by the citizens' taxes, and that data should also be available to them, so that it would also be in the point of creating value on that data. So knowing that the city has been giving out contracts to these companies, or if that the information regarding citizens' calls at the 311 line asking for potholes or asking for graffiti problems, stuff like that. So putting it out, being open, means that there's value being created by the community, and there also being a point of asking questions related to that data. So being sort of like a evidence-based, saying that we know that this is happening and what's being done with that information. But open data is also associated a lot with making sure that we're protecting the privacy of the citizens. So we're not obviously putting out names or private information. And to go further than that, that's where Montreal Commons is trying to do, is create value in mutualization of data between different partners, which are not necessarily part of the City of Montreal. So the City of Montreal is sharing data on mobility, on social issues, but there's other partners on the ground. There's the United Way, there's university researchers, and those people are looking also to create more value. So being able to cross data between different organizations and making sure that we're doing it correctly is a new way of also getting value out of data.
Thank you. I have a follow-up, and maybe I'll kind of start with Robin and then go around. there's kind of the open data versus kind of owning your data, and it would be great, Robin, to sort of talk about that, because naturally, what I'm seeing at Telefilm is many people are collecting data. Primarily maybe for their own purpose. So it would be great if you could sort of talk a bit about that.
Yeah, well, I see open data and sharing data as two completely different separate topics. Open data, of course, as Patrick was discussing, just having those parameters in place to understand what the data is going to be used for, and setting up a data governance structure so that it's very clearly outlined what the research is going to, or what the data is going to be used for, and then how it's going to be shared. I think that's where I would categorize open data. What we do at Mass Culture when we embark on research is we come up with a very clear strategy with everyone we're engaging in the work, including the users and those who are doing the research on. So we have a really clear understanding of who owns the raw data, who owns the data, and who has the right to share the data of the findings that are put together. And I think by creating those really clear parameters, and that's on a very project small scale, is really important. But when you're talking about a larger system within potentially the art sector, I think there needs to be a data governance structure in place, which I know is currently, NAPSE, Capicoa are both working to great strides to try and create an outline for that. I think that's what is required in order to properly share data.
Right. And Joan, I know you're at the early stages of that work, but is that kind of question around owning the data, for lack of a better word, has that come into play already in terms of your conversations?
Yeah, it absolutely has. And I think for us, it's really important to own it, because we want to be able to control. We want it to be open in terms of our reports to be available as widely as possible, but we also want to control how to make sure that we're accountable to the data and how it's updated, how it's disseminated, and ultimately we want to make sure that it's there to make concrete changes with respect to our stakeholders that we're working with.
Great, perfect. I think that's a great moment to flow into a bit more of how do we go about data sharing and the fundamentals. And, Patrick, maybe we can start with you and you can build off of the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, so I was mentioning that at first I was mostly working on open data, and I've moved more into the Montreal Uncommon project, and it's that open data has some limits, because obviously you won't be able to share all of it, and open data has sort of like a spectrum of openness where you're going more sort of like these have really specific issues related to public security or personal information. And when you're trying to build and go forward with those types of information, and you're looking at data governance issues, because you're trying to figure out how the data was created in the first place was not necessarily the way that you're looking at it right now. So you need to make sure that those principles that are shared between who is using the data, and you're trying to create also a climate, sort of like a climate of confidence and between the shareholders, and make sure also that you get the proper engagement from the data, where that are coming from. We're obviously seeing a lot of feedback right now. A lot of people are questioning how data is collected on the private matters. We've seen issues around our phones and social media, stuff like that. So we need to make sure that people that are using this data or sharing this data personally know exactly where you're going with it, and when we've moved to creating the initial candidacy for Montreal in Common, which was the Smart City Challenge at the federal government, and that was part of the reflection. And also seeing that, for example, the First Nations are already looking at those issues around ownership, control, access on their own data. And it's more the same way that the citizens and communities are looking also now, is sort of like being able to get a better control and know what's being done with that information and those data. And also looking at what could be possibly done and what would be possible to know. Because if you want to be able to know an issue, you also need to know how to count, create that data, and make sure that you're not doing it with some biases or prior views on it.
Well, maybe Robin, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, it's absolutely essential, I believe, in order to have a data governance strategy in place, you have to have buy-in from the community. And that takes time, but that's the real work, the important work that I think that needs to happen. You need to bring people along with you throughout the process of building out what that looks like, so that everyone has an understanding and is in agreement and is truly contributed to what that data governance strategy looks like. I think that there needs to be multiple entryways throughout data collection, where the users or those who the data is being done upon can engage with what's currently happening. The more you can have transparency, the better. The more you can have reciprocity, the better. It's really important to understand and really just inhabit. If you are that reciprocity is required. If you are taking taking this information, what are you giving back? And it has to be more than just doing a survey at the beginning and then sharing the information at the end. There's a whole middle part that needs to be considered in order to really go about data sharing properly. Otherwise, you can share it all you want, and no one will be receiving it because they won't understand the relevancy of it. It just won't be in existence. You have to build out the community first in order for open data and data sharing to have any relevance within society. And I also think that taking the time and having the measures in place to understand how that data is being used, and if it's if it's useful to the people that you are, the stakeholders who you are collecting the data for and about, those are two important measures to take into consideration as well.
And maybe, and I'll come back to both of you, but Joan, what it's outside of data sharing, I think it would be interesting, and you touched on it at the beginning, the why. That like building around the why is this data being collected, so that you're, to Robin and Patrick, then you can build that climate of confidence and trust as you're collecting it. So I know that you're going to do another panel and maybe delve more into it, but maybe you can talk a bit about your approach to how do you arrive at the why.
There's so many things that we need to know. So we had to make a decision about what would be most urgent to discover. And so there are three things for us. One is audience related. We don't have any data about race-based audiences. None of the ratings information for television is collected based on race. And I've searched far and wide to find anything that would be useful that was collected on the basis of data. The second thing is we're doing a market intelligence study so that we know who all the Black people are in Canada who are in the industry, at what levels they're at, what successes or barriers they faced, what their level of professionalism is, because we need to know who the community that we serve, and these organizations and funders who are talking about creating programs for this community needs to know who they are and what their needs are before jumping into doing programming. And just one more final thing that we're doing is a best practices guide for authentic and inclusive content, because and it's a study of what does the community want in terms of how they're represented. What are they saying about authentic representation? What are they saying about inclusivity? And with that project, we want to involve everybody. We want the communities involved. We want the funders and other industry members involved, because we need them to, everybody needs to tell us what they want out of this study, because we want it to be used. We want that engagement, and we actually want to move things forward in the industry so that we're creating something new rather than just plugging holes.
That's great. I'd like to then, and Patrick, you touched on it, but we hear with, Apple just talked about how they're going to change some of the parameters to protect privacy. And I think that's such a big part now of why people may not want to engage in any type of research. So can you talk a bit about kind of the ethics and privacy part of the work, in particular the work that you've been doing, and then maybe we can talk more about that governance structure, and Robin maybe can do a bit more on that. But Patrick, over to you first.
Yeah. I did my studies to become a librarian, and privacy issues is one of those main points that we get in library school, that we're there to protect the privacy of the patrons, and that's been sort of like stuck in my head since then. And when I came to working on open data, obviously we're looking a lot around issues on privacy also, and privacy laws are different from one province to the other. And it's also, you get on the more ethical side, because you don't want to stigmatize maybe a population in one neighborhood by sharing open data. So you'll try to find ways to put less of a street-centric information, more of a neighborhood information, to make sure that you're not pointing at, oh, there's this issues happening on this part and you shouldn't be going to that neighborhood, stuff like that. And having those reflections at the Montreal, and also you're mentioning Apple moved its privacy rules on the applications. At the City of Montreal, we put out a data charter, which puts out principles on how data is collected in Montreal. Those reflections were coming out of discussions around IoT, around Internet of Objects. And so the city has this charter, which is trying to put in place inside of the City of Montreal, sort of guiding how ethically we're collecting data, making sure that we explain why we're collecting data, and also getting consent from people who might be affected from using those data. But it's also trying to point out that there's a lot more data being created outside from the city. Our phones are collecting data, our cars now are also collecting data. So it's sort of saying like a city has its limits on what it can control around who's collecting data on the part of the land of the city, but trying to put this charter out and saying that we should limit maybe some types of collection of data. Maybe we should think about issues around ethical use of the data, making sure that you don't keep the data internally or for eternity just to keep the data. Maybe you figure out that after some time you need to delete that data. And so I think we're in different parts of society, we're more and more aware of issues related to data, and I think that it's part of also being more informed on how the data is being used. What Apple is doing this week is, for me, maybe it's going to be eye-opening for some citizens. Obviously, the ones that are more aware already knew that those applications were doing that stuff. But for somebody trying to open a flashlight application, it's going to ask, do you want to share a data location from your phone with the flashlight app? So like, why does a flashlight app needs my geolocation data? Will probably be bringing questions, and people, let's hope that people will go further and trying to understand what's happening. So
that's great. So Robin, maybe it would be great to sort of get a sense of when you're approaching things, like what does structuring kind of that governance look like? And then my follow-up would also be, you talked about, it has to go past, the survey and the introduction. So what does that look like in terms of ensuring people really understand where their information, their personal information will be kept and how it would be shared?
Well, I think it's important to note that there's no point in creating anything from scratch. There's already some really interesting models and organizations in place that we can look to. I know the University of Waterloo has a community research ethics office. So just like academia with their REB, this is a service that's provided to those who are conducting research within the community, because it is absolutely essential, I think, in order to move forward. Mass culture, which is strongly promoting greater research be done within the arts sector, I think in order to do that and do it well and take in everything that you can into consideration, you need to ensure that you aren't doing any harm, or at least have a complete awareness of the potential harms before going forward in that. Also, the First Nations data governance strategy is also an important resource to look at. They've built a structure that I think they've taken a great deal of time to put a lot of consideration into. So those are a couple of examples of already existing models that I think that we can learn from and go to if needed. What does it look like? So for mass culture, our way of engaging people within data collection, research from beginning to end is to come up with as many creative strategies to engage the sector and broker connections between academia and the sector as much as possible. There are a couple of different ideas that we've come up with. For example, currently we are doing some research, just sent out a survey about collecting some people's thoughts on innovation in governance for arts boards. So as a part of that, we are encouraging data parties so we can bring people together to have conversations if they want to talk before filling out the surveys. And then we will, once we collect those findings, come up with a number of different digital roundtables, pick out particular themes that have been collected within the survey to have a little bit of a deeper dive. We believe at Mass Culture that research and data are a living thing. And as soon as you close the door and send out a report, the research ultimately leaves people a voice out of that research. So we want to keep that door open by continuing to have research looked at, informed, analyzed, and continue the conversation and make sure that it's an ongoing thing. So there's never an endpoint, we believe, to the type of information that we're interested in collecting. And I think that the more strategies that we can develop to bring people around the table and have a real space for debate is a very healthy thing.
That's great. Now let's move into I kind of the where's the money, and and what does buy-in look like? And so Joan, you've just said you've got three different tracks in terms of data and capturing information to just help the Black Screen Office really take off and do the work that it needs to get done. So maybe can you talk a bit about your experience? Any surprises or none at all?
Everything's new, so everything's surprising. But I guess one of the big surprises is how that people are not pushing back on the fact that this data is needed, and also that we are being trusted to find methods as an independent organizations to gather it. To go out and find, the right companies to consult with to do the work, but it's an uphill battle raising the funding. But I'm actually finding that to be a really engaging process. When you speak to like a broadcaster or a funder or an advertising agency about your project, you learn that much more about what it is and what their needs are. They're super, super collaborative and wanting to provide their expertise and involvement. So we're getting buy-in from the very beginning. So when I was kind of thrown out there to go and find money, it seemed like a daunting task, but it's turning out to be a collaborative learning experience. And what I'm hoping is that will carry through, and that will have the buy-in when these studies come out, so that our funders and community members and all the different people we're using in focus groups and advisory groups will be ambassadors of the study and will extend the reach far beyond what we'd be able to do on our own.
That's great. Robin?
I come from a very privileged perspective on this because I work in a very supported sector by some funders who understand the importance and relevance of data collection and sharing data. And so we've found some great partners in funders themselves, the Toronto Arts Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, Canadian Heritage, and the Ontario Trillium Foundation. I think they have been real champions and worked with us to find strategies of how we can generate a more collective voice within the sector, so the sector can speak from as much of a unified front as it can on in the information that it's collecting, because that is the commonality amongst all of us. We have so many different voices within the arts sector, but the commonality is the importance of knowledge and information and research. So I feel very supported in that way. And it's really important to us at the same time, in order for the research to remain pure, that we are very mindful of how we go about financing the research and data collection that we're doing. So that is definitely an obstacle, I would say. But the more you can work and create strategic partnerships with those who you're working with, the more opportunities there may be to support the work that you're doing in terms of research and data on a number of different levels, not just financial.
Great. And I see, Joan, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that your organization, Francesca, Telefilm Canada, has been hugely supportive when it comes to data collection, being the first ones in and recognizing the value of having an independent do it. I know a lot of these agencies do their own internal reports, but seeing the value of the community taking data into their own hands and being able to collect it and generate it and use it as they see fit, I think is a huge support.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And I was actually because one of the things I wanted to ask Robin based on that is what happens when you're pitching kind of a data collection and you have multiple voices trying to shift the change of that, because it's definitely something. So it's nice to hear we didn't do that, Joan. But Robin, it was kind of part of my follow-up as you're pulling all these, communities together.
That's going to be an ongoing challenge for sure, and a negotiation, and hopefully one that I'll be honing my skills on, so that we can all come around the table with some sense of agreement. It's a discussion. You have to have that conversation so you can understand what is the values and principles around the work that you're doing. What is it that everyone is what is that research agenda? And have everyone get on board in agreement with that. It's there's always going to be people who come around the table for their own specific reasons, but I think that if you can create a space where people are able to see beyond themselves, because it's important for the sake of and health and a thriving, in my case, art sector, then and just really embody that, I think that people. I think people can buy into that. And if they can't, then they probably aren't the right partners to be working with. So, yeah, that's what yeah.
Perfect. Patrick?
Yeah, I just wanted to go in here and mention that in the Montreal in Common projects, there's two big hubs of data that are trying to be created, one on social issues and one around mobility. And I was just coming out of a meeting around that, the social data hub this morning. And it's been a year of working on a common ground and trying to figure out what would be like for every organization showing up into that table and talking and seeing like what would be like the main issues right now that needs to be addressed with data, what we could be collected together and figure out, because all of the partners, there's the Public Health of Montreal, there's the Way of Montreal also showing up there, the City of Montreal is there, not only me, but other people. And sort of figuring out like, what do we have together that on our own we're not able to see, and bring it together and see what's being created out of that. So I would say the point of the Smart City Challenge that Infrastructure Canada was put out was that we would create and do something that would be shared with the community and also shared with other cities in Canada. So we have a public part that was going to start be showing up, where we're sharing how we're experimenting around the use of data, and hopefully by the end of the project in 2024, we'll be able to show new ways of collecting and visualization data on social data hubs.
So here's my out of the box question, but again, sort of thinking about that Apple. When do we start charging for the data that we collect? Because there is so much around that, and as an organization where we're often asked, to supply data, not that we're going to start charging it, just made me realize, everyone else, the private sector uses data as a way, to monetize, and we don't in the arts necessarily do that. I just throw it out. I don't know if anyone wants to jump into the pool on that question, but it's something that I found interesting. Joan?
For me, my ultimate goal is to see change happen, and that's the capital. Charging, I know there's a couple of really big companies in our country that capture data, and it's so expensive to get that your average person doesn't have any access to it. And I think that we're talking about, for me in the screen industries, we're talking about massive changes that need to happen, and it's about mobilizing that knowledge that we need to, use as a foundation to make big changes, and money can't be a factor in this regard.
Right.
I would say that access is absolutely paramount. So putting a price tag on data that actually doesn't really belong to you ever is just not in the cards from my perspective. However, how that if there could be a fee for service, if data needs to be analyzed, digested, compiled in a particular way, then I can see the value in charging something for that, because that's a service. If someone wants, for example, what Joan is doing in a form of data visualization, then that should be paid for. But I think that the data itself should be made accessible.
That's great. I'm mindful that we wanted to actually open it up for questions. So if any of you watching have any questions for us, I'm happy to take them. And maybe as we wait, I think, what would be interesting for me is talking a bit more about, I'm always, it's that idea of the iterations of at what point, when you're in the middle of doing kind of a data collection, what happens when you're like, oh, we really should have asked this question or that question, because you're kind of halfway through sometimes in collecting it. So it's just for me, because I'm living through it right now. So I don't know if, Patrick or Robin or even Joan, your early days, but if you've had any of those experiences where suddenly you start to look at some of the responses and you're like, we actually missed the real question.
Actually, we did. I have that even early on. Even early on, I'll go fast because my answer is small. Even early on, when we looked at which stakeholders we wanted to engage in focus groups and advisory groups, we had sort of overlooked a whole sector really of sort of gatekeepers, and figured, well, we really need to go back and re-examine our budget even to make sure that we had enough resources to be able to take the time and resources to go and engage those people as well.
Robin or Patrick?
I was going to say that unfortunately you'll find out most of those things when you're doing it. So I would say don't feel bad about figuring out through it. You sort of have to learn from it and do sort of like a feedback loop where you say, next time I'll be maybe more precise on this aspect, or maybe I should ask this thing and it will be clearer for a survey or stuff like that. So we work a lot on that perspective in Montreal Commons, sort of saying like, do a small step, learn from it, do a feedback loop, and go for it the next time. So I think it's the best way to have a good view out of it.
Yeah, I agree with Patrick. It's a very iterative learning process, I think, in data collection and conducting research. We last November completed a SHIRT grant in partnership with Ryerson University. And then as soon as I shared the findings, there was expectation for more. So you almost have to look at it as a layering. So there's still opportunities to layer on more to that to those findings. So, for example, what we did is one of the suggestions that came back to us was that we needed to actually collect some stories about the research that we were doing. So we partnered with actually Humber College and a group of their arts management students and collected those stories to accompany and complement the research that we've done. So I think that there's definitely strategies in ways if you feel as though you missed some fundamental pieces in the initial research to go about it so that you can add on those layers.
Joan?
One thing I found useful at the RFP stage is to get feedback into the RFP so that as many people or as many of your stakeholders can have a look at what you think that you're going to do and be able to upfront really give you an idea of what their expectations might be. And, together, you'll never get it all, but I think approaching it from outside of yourself and engaging as many people as you can who you trust before you even begin, I think is really valuable.
I want to build on to because I see no questions, so I've got plenty of my own. When we were talking about the buy-in, the other side of that buy-in process are the expectations that are attached to that. And maybe I'll use this as Robin and Patrick. Any advice you could give to Joan, who's sort of building that, to just be mindful, because I think you're always, even if you've had these amazing conversations, you've talked about the parameters. Again, we all see it, right? We become the data geeks. We start to see that and we want to know more. We want to dig in and we want to manipulate. So I wonder if Robin or Patrick, if you have, sort of an experience that we can sort of walk away from, just even as it's going to happen regardless, whether you set those boundaries in place or not. Patrick?
I would say that we always think that we're the only ones that are doing something. And I think the magic of the internet is that there's always somebody somewhere that has probably done it already and trying to connect with those people. There's always people that are gladly want to share and be able to help you on your own work, and they'll learn from what you're doing also. So sort of benchmarking and building on what others are doing. From what I've been seeing is that the more you're open on what you're doing, the more people will also maybe send you a tweet or email saying, hey, I've seen that you're working on this. I've been working on the same subject for a couple of years, stuff like that. So I think it's to be open out there, and we are all learning from each other.
All right. Robin?
Yeah, we're all learning from each other, that's for sure. And I think a really important part is to figure out who is doing like-minded work, and you can connect the dots and learn from each other. There's so many different perspectives that you can look at from one thing. So the more different perspectives you can find ways of bringing into the room and having those conversations, I think it's really important. We recently did. There's a couple of different papers done on harassment in the live performing arts. And so what we did at Mass Culture is we brought those 4 different perspectives together and had them all share their information, where they connected, where they might have disagreed with one another, because I think that in itself is really important to paint a full picture of what's out there and what's true.
So I do have a few questions. So Robin, I think one of the questions is for you. Hosting data parties, digital roundtables is a great practice for shared meaning making around the data. Do you have any examples of resources for how to do this well?
Oh man, this year has been a big year of learning, as I'm sure we're all aware of, moving everything online. I guess the one upside to all of this is that because we're online and Mass Culture is a national organization, we're able to have those national dialogues, and we can choose whether they need to be in a closed room or if they need to be wide open gatherings. That is a consideration and a tip that I would give to anyone when entering into these types of activities, is to really think through who needs to be there and who isn't there. That's the very fundamental first steps we always go through when building out a research engagement strategy at Mass Culture. I think it's also important to bring in the people who were the creators of that research so that they can be a part of the entire process, but make sure you're bringing in other perspectives, because it's really important not to have a hierarchy in these particular activities. It's important to make everyone feel as though they have a voice at the table.
Yeah, I've got more questions. Suddenly we've got thank you, everybody. Now we've got a lot of great questions. Are there currently any good sources that someone could use right now for data in arts in Canada? It's one of the things that I was thinking about. Are there places that we can drive people, or websites to start seeing who's doing what data? Or I'll look to either Patrick or Robin if you've got a short answer around that.
Well, I can share with you, for those who are in the room right now, that at the end of June, Mass Culture, in partnership with the University of Toronto, will be launching a repository for data and research on arts and culture called Artifacts. So stay tuned or sign up to our newsletter so that you can have that one-stop shop.
Perfect. The next one is, how does an organization make sure it's not collecting or hoarding data for data's sake? Are there questions we can ask ourselves to make sure we're being mindful and intentional around this? I think, Joan, you answered some of it, but maybe do you want to delve a bit deeper into that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, at the end of the day, who's it for and how are you going to use it? Again, everything that we do has to serve a function of advocacy, of career advancement. We're looking at getting baseline data that really doesn't exist anywhere. And so, and we're a small organization, so everything that we do has to be economical and of use, and we need to know that we're doing everything we can in terms of knowledge mobilization in every form and in every kind of asset that we can think of to mobilize our findings with all our stakeholders.
Perfect. Excellent. The next question is, and maybe Patrick, do you work with outside contractors to create your surveys and report back on them? And I would almost say that follow-up, maybe as we're looking for those outside contractors, are there certain skill sets or things that we should be looking at to find the right fit for the work that we're doing? So maybe I'll start with Patrick and then maybe Robin or Joan, if you want to join in.
So that was one of the things that I learned from working with Open Data in Montreal, is that there's a lot of research being done on in different departments. It's often done also by university professors or projects that they have, and I think it's to reach out to what has already been done on different subjects, because there's always somebody out there that's interested in doing some surveys, some reports, and research that could also be useful for them in their research. So for example, in Montreal has an office that does relationships with universities, so they're also always helpful to figure out who's in the subject right now, maybe, or has a grant around something. So I think it's mostly trying to look out in around your organization, around subjects, to find out who's interested to help you on those questions.
That's great. Well, now is my cue to start wrapping up. I think, what I hope that our viewers, it's so strange because it's like a television show now, isn't it? Our whole life has become a television show. But I hope that what you walk away with is a bit more in terms of just how and when we share data, even the general approach of before you even start your project, like what are those questions, really that why, that buy-in, who is it for, how is it going to be used? And I think now more than ever, that work really has to be done. And I really appreciate that all of you said it's doing that important labor-intensive work at the beginning of bringing people in and really exploring the questions and having them engage with that energy of wanting to commit to the overall why of the project, and many other things. They ask you to do a summary, and I just got too involved in listening to everything you say, but I made lots of notes. I have great notes. I love knowledge mobilization, climate of confidence. I just kept writing down phrases you were all saying. So thank you for helping me with my job as a comms person. Then I think what I'd also like to say is I want to redirect you. Our colleague Joan is starring in the next broadcast following up, engaging diverse audiences. There are also two other activities you can look at: how the majors in Toronto are collaborating, and do I really need a CRM? Always a good question to ask. Thank you, Joan and Patrick and Robin. What a great conversation. I love these panels where I know I'm actually going to reach out to many of you after to have whole other conversations about the work that you're doing. If you have more questions, you could share them on social media, hashtag Data Echo Culture, and all of us can follow up with the organizers. Thank you. It's 1 o'clock. Look at us on time. Well done, group.
Thanks, Francesca. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.